My name is George Gamota, and I live in Lexington. I've lived here for 27 years, and really enjoying the town and the community. I was born in Western Ukraine. However, at the time I was born, it was part of Poland. And when my parents were born, it was part of Austria-Hungary. And before that, it kept changing hands. So the history is very complicated and really leads to some of the issues relating to World War I, I'm going to be talking about my grandparents who lived through World War I and firsthand knowledge that they passed on to me. Although some of the facts I only learned when I was an adult, because my father really did not want to share them, since there were some very terrible things that have happened during that period of time. My relationship with my grandparents is actually very little. My maternal grandfather passed away. Actually, he was killed by Stalin in the 30s when he was in Eastern Ukraine. My paternal grandfather, I think I met him once when I was a baby, and then we never crossed paths. The only grandparent that I had any interaction with is my maternal grandmother, who I saw until I was 5 years old, at which point we immigrated and she stayed behind. She helped my mother take care of me and my brother. But then at 5 years of age, when my family left Ukraine, I never saw her and had no interaction with her. My paternal grandfather was a judge. He was educated in Vienna and practiced law in Western Ukraine, which under that period of time was under Austria-Hungary control. My maternal grandfather also was educated in Vienna. He had a PhD in biology. He also was in the reservist Austrian army, which then, when Austria-Hungary fell apart, he became a Ukrainian colonel in the army. Both of them were married and had families. Most people don't realize that we celebrate the end of World War I on November 11th, 1918, but it is actually the beginning of a war that continued on regionally until about 1924. Ukraine declared independence in 1918 when three empires started to unravel: the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Tsarist Russian Empire. Ukraine took this as an opportunity to unite the peoples and declared independence. My paternal grandfather was in the government of fledgling Ukrainian government as in the Department of Justice, and my maternal grandfather was a colonel in the Ukrainian army. And those are the roles that they played essentially during World War I. My father, who was then 16 years old, joined the militia. My paternal grandfather underground built the Ukrainian government, because by 1914 it became obvious that there was going to be major shift in alliances, and so the Ukrainian government started coalesce, pulling people together and forming a government which they hoped they will be able to launch, which they did, but in a very short time. My maternal grandfather was a colonel in the army, and essentially in a city called Kolomea, and he was the commander of the army there. Initially, it was part of Austrian army, but when Austria fell apart, it became automatically a Ukrainian army. Yes, my father actually suffered the longest. He was, when he volunteered to join the militia at 16, he was captured and considered a prisoner of war and spent a year essentially in jail, while my paternal grandfather was jailed, but at that time he was sent to a city, and some of the people he knew there, and he basically bribed them to get out of jail. Not directly as a result of the war, although the consequences of the war. My maternal grandfather, and it's a long story, but he, in 1918, he and his troops marched to Kiev to relieve the city because the White Russians were occupying it. He got captured and sent to Kazakhstan, where he spent a year in jail. In Russia, the Red Army won. They beat out the White Army, and so he was released. But he could not go back to his hometown because by that time Poland occupied it and he would be a prisoner of war. So he stayed in eastern Ukraine until 1933, where the artificial famine consumed millions of people in eastern Ukraine, and also Stalin executed everyone that he felt was a threat to him, and my grandfather was considered a threat. After the war, which I said lasted for quite a few years after 1918, my paternal grandfather was considered, I would say, not a friend of the new government, which was then in Poland, and so he couldn't get a job for 3 years. And then after that, he started basically doing small consulting, but his career was over as far as being a judge. And then Second World War, he left permanently for Poland and never had any kind of a job whatsoever as a result of his work as a Ukrainian independence mover. My father, after the war, after he was released, went back to school, finished getting his degree in forest engineering, spent a year in Vienna completing his studies, and then worked as a forest engineer throughout Eastern Europe, which was basically parts of Poland and Ukraine. The Carpathian Mountains were sort of his playground, if you will. As I started to think about it, World War I really impacted my family, because the reason why we're here in the United States is because a direct result of what happened in World War I. The end of World War I was actually not very well done. The impact created the genesis for World War II, which really forced my family to leave the homeland, Ukraine, and seek a freedom. My father left with his family, and it was very tough because my brother was quadriplegic. He was concerned that the Nazis were going to eradicate him, and so rather than using mass transportation, he had wagon and horses and went through the Carpathians to Vienna to seek freedom. People have asked me, why am I interested in World War I? And on reflection, I think it's a good question. As I think about it, World War I made a big difference in the path of our families, some of which probably would have major changes. Others have moved beyond my, I'm not very good.
I understand. Well, maybe it is best if I were to read it and then ask you a question or something.
Well, you said you had a teleprompter.
I do have one. The problem is the teleprompter is, I can do it, but it might even be more difficult because of, I found it to be a little disconcerting.
Okay, well, let me read it and then
Maybe
in segments.
Maybe what I should do is just have a conversation with you based upon what I read in here.
Terrific.
Let's try that one. Okay. So George, why do you care so much about World War I?
It's a good question. For many years, as I have gone to Cary Hall, I noticed that there was a plaque on the right side as you enter. And I wondered about it, but that's about as far as it went. Last year, when we celebrated the beginning of World War I, of America's entrance, that plaque started to be of interest to me because I realized that Lexington played a major role in World War I. It was just not something that considered to be a European war. My further interest in that was when I realized that there is a drawer underneath, and I asked about it, and Peter Kelly and Sam Dorn opened the drawer and told me that there was a scroll, a time capsule scroll. But they closed it up and didn't really tell me what the contents were. So a few months later, I got permission from the town to open up the scroll and photograph it. And I realized this was a treasure that was hidden from Lexingtonians for nearly 100 years, because it listed every single volunteer who participated in World War I. And it was a treasure because there are 373 names there. Now you have to think that Lexington in 1918 was a town of 6,000 people. 6,000, if you think about it, 373, it impacted 1 out of every 2 families. In fact, as I looked at the scroll, there were a number of families that sent 2 or 3 of their children. And maybe it was a father and a child. There was one family that had 2 sons and 2 daughters. Yes, 9 women participated in World War I. Lexington, as in Massachusetts, generally helped in World War I in the medical fields. In fact, one of our heroes, Stanley Hill, was a medical driver in a van and got killed in the war. And so Lexington has a very rich history in having participated in World War I.